Hi, everyone. Welcome to Abundance, the California YIMBY podcast. I'm your erstwhile co-host, Ned Resnikoff, Policy Director of California YIMBY, and I'm joined by the full-time host, Nolan Gray, Research Director.
Great to be chatting.
We have an episode I've been excited about for a while coming up. We're talking to Professor Danielle Allen, professor of political philosophy, ethics, and public policy at Harvard University, and director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation. She's also the author of the recent book, Justice by Means of Democracy. And more important to this particular conversation was an interlocutor with a friend of the pod, Misha Chellam, about this question of governance that I think kind of overshadows everything that we do and that we talk about as YIMBYs, and in particular the distinction between what Misha called abundance progressivism and what Dr. Allen calls power sharing liberalism. So Dr. Allen, first off, welcome to the show. Very delighted to have you here. And second, I was wondering if you could kick us off by maybe talking a little bit about what you see as the difference between abundance progressives and power sharing liberals.
Great. No, thank you so much, Ned. Thank you, Nolan. It's great to be here. Please feel free to call me Danielle as we, proceed in this conversation. And I really appreciate your work. I wanted to say, first of all, thank you for the leadership that California YIMBY is offering on the policy front. I think that you have really put policy models out there that the whole country would benefit from. So really appreciate that work. And I also appreciate the fact that you're driving this conversation about abundance. It's so important, I think, new model for our political economy. So I'm really glad to connect and happy to talk about the overlaps and distinctions between abundance progressivism and power sharing liberalism. There is a lot of overlap, and so maybe I'll start with that first. And then I think the distinction is more a little bit, I'd call a kind of open area on the abundance side, as opposed to necessarily a hard distinction. But with regard to overlap, I think we're both focused on a model of political economy, which is, focused on unlocking the kinds of bottlenecks that make the wrong things scarce. So there's always scarcity of some kind, right? I mean, that's just sort of the nature of human life, but we live in a circumstance where housing, for instance, access to clean air and water, things like that, really basic necessities, have become scarce in ways that they shouldn't be. And they are scarce because of bad policy choices and because of problems of ineffectiveness in governance. So there's a real need to unlock that. And for me, that it's about good governance, effective government, bringing together the powers of the market, the powers of the public sector, the powers of civil society. So the idea is you don't have to start with a kind of black and white view that, it must always be the market, everything must be privatized, or it must always be the public sector. And it's the only way to sort of do anything that is about the public good. One has to sort of recognize there's also a third force, namely civil society, nonprofits, a variety of alternative kinds of organizational structure. And you really need combinations of the three things to solve public goods problems. And when you start to look at this issue of things that are scarce but should be abundant that way, one really can see new policy solutions. And again, I think the sort of directions being pursued in California to unlock the housing production problem are good examples of that kind of tripartite policy structure. So we share that. I think that's where abundance progressivism and power sharing liberalism overlap. And the reason that approach is a part of power sharing liberalism is because I am really interested in making the case for that in the core role of empowerment to thriving in people's lives. So from my point of view, human well-being is not just about material conditions. So abundance is necessary, but not sufficient from my point of view. Abundance that is coupled with disempowerment will leave us with the same experiences of alienation and anger and frustration, and therefore unstable social systems that we currently have. So for me, it has to be abundance with empowerment. And for me, empowerment depends on the material bases for successful participation in our civic life. So abundance is the material base that I think we need for that experience of empowerment. And I will just maybe tell one little story to sort of show how these things come together. But I recently, had the wonderful and intense experience of running for governor here in Massachusetts. And so you just learn so much from that process. I remember one occasion after an event, a young woman reached out and said, "Hey, can I schedule a call with you?" It's like, of course, absolutely, love to follow up. And she wanted to share that. She'd been really struck whenever I sort of spoke. I always told stories about how I came from a family with a real tradition of civic engagement, and I was kind of carrying that on in my run for governor. And she said that as she listened to me, she realized that she too came from a family with a real tradition of civic engagement, but she herself was not engaged. And that led her to really ask herself why. Like, why was she not, reaching out for that experience of empowerment? And she realized it was because rent is so high where she lives that she knows she's not going to stay there. She's going to be moving on, and she's been moving on pretty routinely. And she realized that with that kind of transient experience in her housing situation, she was just never going to commit to a community and put in the time to be civically engaged. So people don't realize that housing is actually a core citizenship issue, but it really is. So at any rate, for me, that empowerment piece is non-negotiable. And I think for abundance progressives, it hasn't been the center of attention, is how I would put it, basically. So, and I think people are in different places as to whether or not, some people I think are worried that if you focus too much on empowerment and making sure people have access to civic participation, you might get blockages to effective governance. And I'm very interested in the solutions to empowerment that are aligned with also achieving effective governance.
But picking up a theme there, I mean, I think the empowerment piece is interesting because, as you say in your essay in Radical Exchange and in your book, this is, I think, a theme that carries over to MAGA conservatives, right? About relationships between this perception of a separate elite that's talking down to us. And I think it's kind of powerful that you draw that connection among these groups that people wouldn't normally put in the same category on anything. But I want to kind of pick your brain a little bit on participation, because I think, the 9,000 foot view of the last 70 years of planning is we did the Robert Moses hardcore technocratic top-down experts are going to control everything. Of course, this is a disaster on a whole bunch of margins. And then we've the pendulum has swung over to a planning system where we kind of obsessively are doing public hearings. And, there's evidence that these public hearings are not very representative. I think, how do we do power sharing and participation right? Maybe in a way that doesn't just get captured, as our current participatory institutions often are, by unrepresentative NIMBY groups or wealthy homeowner groups. How do we approach that in maybe more of a practical sense, do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the right question. And I appreciate that you asked a how question, right? Because lots of times people will ask the question like, can we, achieve the sort of approaches to governance that give us participation and effectiveness together? And my answer to that is, it's not a question of can we, because it's necessary that we do. And the reason it's necessary is, again, because of the value of empowerment to human lives. And so given that it's necessary, the question to ask is the how question. So that's why I so appreciate that you asked the how question, not the whether question. So on the how question, I think the good news is that, as in so many parts of our social system right now, we are at sort of the cusp of major innovation in governance tools. And that is about technology and AI. I mean, it's not the case that those technologies are simply harmful. I mean, there is a lot of harm we anticipate and that we need to address. But there are opportunities too. And one of the most interesting kinds of opportunities is tools that better support sort of structured gathering of opinion, supportive engagement in ways that helps people find common ground that's not actually immediately visible on the surface. So you may know about some of these tools, but there is a platform called, sometimes it gets called Polis, sometimes it gets called Be Taiwan. And what it does is sort of takes controversial issues, it's used in Taiwan most above all, but and structures participation so that you really are getting the full breadth of stakeholders. You're not just getting, the NIMBY voices or the most intensely felt ones. Also, people are able to participate in natural language in their own words. So they don't have to kind of fit into the buckets of a survey or a public opinion poll, which is already shaping the agenda. And then because you can do that, you can synthesize at scale, and you can start to find solutions to problems that weren't visible based on sort of previous structures for participatory engagement. So I think we can see kind of concrete cases of effective resolution of challenging problems in Taiwan. And so the question for me is, how can we port some of those tools and methods into our systems of representative government here in the US?
I think there's
my partner and I, sorry, quick thing on the Taiwan point. My partner and I spent a week in Taiwan, and it felt like the most intensely political place I've ever been outside of the US. So if they're figuring out solutions for this, I'm confident that they can be transposed here.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and I think if you want to sell something to Yimbies, talking about its utility in Taiwan is always going to be a real selling point. I wanted to ask, I mean, I think there's the sort of question of technically how do we solicit this input, but I think there's another question, maybe equally or in some cases more important, about at what level the input happens.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, for example, right now the way that it works in much of California is that you have a community input model for every single project, including the smallest, most modest residential project in a city.
Mm-hmm.
And Nolan and I have talked a lot about this idea that we need to bring back actual planning. So the idea that you have a sort of democratic process for a citywide general plan, but then if a project conforms to that general plan, it's like, well, the city, the community has already sort of planned to allow for that. And so I guess I'm curious how you think about that. Like, is there a role for project by project planning, or is it the sort of thing that should happen more at the citywide level or neighborhood level?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. And I would move it up to the, I think it can be either citywide or regional. It sort of depends on what the issue is, or neighborhood, or if you take the case of land use in renewable energy contexts, it could literally be like the folks who sort of share the same wind footprint. And so I do think this is the hardest, well, there's many hard problems in this space, but one of the hardest problems in the space is the fact that our current jurisdictional structures don't always map the footprint of the affected community for a given issue. So that's where, the kind of thing I'm wrestling with and my lab is working on is kind of find the concrete cases where that's true. And then how do you start to actually give people access to a governance structure that aligns with the actual footprint of impact? And how do you make that work given the existing legacy jurisdictional structures? So I don't think we have answers to that question yet, but I feel like that's the problem we have to solve. So for example, again, using, renewable energy is basically a land use issue, right? Because it takes so much more land to source energy through renewable sources, whether solar or wind. So at the end of the day, it's like anybody who thinks about land use, like we need you in the kind of climate conversation because it is just fundamentally a land use question. And so, I think what we're, working on is the different structures of kind of collective ownership, so that the benefits that could come from harvesting the renewable energy resource that you are somehow connected to, either because you're upwind or downwind or someplace in between, but if the wind gets used, you're going to be affected by it. Those kinds of things might give us some new governance structures that can kind of come in and help us break through some of our impasses. That's the sort of thing we're trying to figure out to, again, align the need for that participatory element that does deliver the appropriate kind of empowerment, but is also driving towards something effective.
How do you avoid the problem there of layering on so many different jurisdictions that all kind of overlap one particular area? Because out here we already have jurisdictions that I think are intended to get at that, but you end up with a sort of mess of, okay, you have the water district, you have this mosquito abatement district, you have the school district, you have the city, you have the county. All of them are collecting taxes from you. You're voting for board members on each one, but you don't know who they are or what they're doing. How do you avoid that?
well, no, I mean, again, like this is what I meant when I said I think this is one of the hardest problems, right? Actually, this is the problem we have to tackle. I don't have the answers, but we haven't really defined the problem yet, I don't think, in a way that makes it tractable. So one of the work streams in my lab just runs under the heading of aspirational federalism. And what we're really talking about is the challenge of federalism, that sort of multi-layered jurisdictional structure. We use the phrase aspirational federalism because for us, a healthy federalist system is one where you're achieving kind of harmonization across the jurisdictional levels. That's where the aspirational part comes in. And we don't have that right now, period. And so the question is, how could we get more of that? When the federal system was designed in the late 18th century, they were actually like really explicit about the different kinds of functions that would be assigned to different levels. So for example, that like agriculture should be, they thought at the time, like handled at the state level, for instance, not at the federal level. And they just like made all these kind of decisions, like this one's national, this one has to be regional, and therefore it goes to the states and so on. They never expected those decisions to be permanent. And so somehow or other, we don't have, right now the kind of elasticity to be able to move things around. That's partly why I'm so excited about the housing work that's underway, because I do think in that space, you are, in addition to achieving abundance in production for housing, you're also actually helping us like reinvent the structure of federalism. And I would love to kind of be more explicit about that, right? So the fact that you have a kind of statewide zoning or whatever, right? It's like lifting from the municipal to the state level for a given kind of decision. And sometimes I feel like we should just like take, all the different functional decisions that are being made about housing at different jurisdictional levels and like put them in a chart and then like ask ourselves, like, are these really at the right level? Like which one should move up, which one should move down? And then there's another question, like, how do you actually pull that off politically? But we haven't even really done that kind of analysis. And so for me, the first step is just like, let's do that analysis and see if there's any like low-hanging fruit that we could easily sort of address, et cetera. And then like, let's figure out the politics of the hardest problems and so on. So
do you have some sort of heuristic for where you draw the line? Because I could see there could be a certain amount of creep in either direction where, there's a certain argument for centralizing all decisions at the highest possible level. There's another argument for kind of dispersing them to the local level. And so for an example, I mean, you mentioned wind power. You could say that it falls within the community that is essentially in the path of that wind channel. The other way to think about it would be to say, well, wind power is a sort of core renewable infrastructure requirement that the entire country needs in order to transition off of carbon fuels. And then you could even from there, it's not that far to making an argument about essentially planetary governance. So I mean, that's maybe like a little bit of an absurd example, but I mean, how do you think about where to draw that line?
yeah, no, it's a great example, not absurd at all. It's like exactly the right kind of thing to think about. So let me try to speak to that, and then let me also actually give you an example from the housing context too. So the point about the wind flow kind of community who's a part of that specific wind flow is not really in a sense that all decisions are like just up to that community. Is rather that at a macro level, you're designing a policy that is going to give the right kind of incentive systems to maximize participation in harvesting that resource. And the relevant kind of structure that maximizes the harvesting of that resource in this context is one that sends the benefits back to the people who also bear the burdens. You won't get that necessarily if you have a kind of statist, top-down, like decision, eminent domain, we're going to do this and that, so forth. The idea is that you'll actually get more of the macro if you design it right for the micro. And actually, maybe I'll give you an example from the COVID context first, and then an example from the housing context. This will turn into a long answer, so I apologize, but anyway, bear with me. So my team did a huge amount of work on COVID And in some sense, this work we're trying to do on federalism has kind of really come out of our experience during the COVID crisis. And we had this one really like powerful learning moment really early on, spring of 2020, where we were making the case that people were making this huge mistake to think there was a trade-off between the economy and health. Like, you can't have a healthy economy without healthy people. You can't have healthy people without a functioning economy. So it's like, how do you have both things? Like, how do you get these things aligned is the kind of actual question we should have been pursuing. And our view was the way you get both is by really ramping up your production of tests, abundance. Like, we need an abundance of tests so that people could know where the disease was. And so, people could actually go to work, but also control the movement of the disease. So as we were doing this work, the first thing we did was like map out like March 2020 at a macro level, like how much testing would the country need to have that abundance so that we could actually function, without closing the economy. And we built a network of mayors to give us feedback on this kind of policy structure as like a roadmap for the country to take forward. And the first thing the mayors did, like they read it and they came to our meeting and so forth, and they all said, well, this is great. And like, it gives us a sense of what we as a country could potentially do. But like, how on earth does this help us now in our present circumstances in any way help our communities? Because you're talking about, I can't remember how many millions of tests, we put in there right now, but like whatever, I've got a community of 30,000 people, like, what do I do? So they basically said, can you come back and please tell us the actions we could take at our level that would like sum up to what it is you see for the aggregate. So we did that. Like, we went back, we totally redesigned the policy to answer the question of like, well, what at the micro level has to actually happen in order to get that macro effect? And that's really the dynamic that I'm describing between the different levels. So to say that you're going to focus on a region or a specific affected community does not mean that you have to like totally separate from the larger or macro context or where the sort of like state interest is trying to drive. It gives you a very different framework for doing that sort of state level policy work. It really requires you to say, like, how do we help the microenvironment function in a way that delivers the macro output? And so that insight, that conversation with the mayors is like where the idea of aspirational federalism came from. And that is sort of what we have been working with since then. So housing context, just to give you an example, I'm curious what you think. So in my run for governor, housing was my top priority agenda item. And I'm delighted to say that our current governor has also made housing her top priority agenda item and has a really good, interesting bill. I hope you guys are paying attention to it that she's working on moving through our legislature now. I looked at the California bill and was super interested in it. And obviously the sort of ADU, zoning statewide and so forth and et cetera. At the end of the day, what I did in the policy I proposed, I think her policy now is a bit closer to the Californian one, to be honest. But what I did was propose something that gave municipalities a menu of options. So they had constrained choice, in other words, like statewide, we need everybody to choose from this like shortish list of options, some zoning changes, but you can pick for your community which ones you're going to choose. And in addition, we're gonna, as a part of this, require and incentivize with some resources, some regional planning around some of the infrastructure questions that are connected to the changes in your community that will follow from the necessity of adopting among these zoning requirements. So that was a mouthful, obviously. That was a lot more words to say than ADUs statewide, right? So there's a political challenge there. But the point is, we used a kind of constrained choice model to combine that, participatory empowerment piece with the sort of strategic direction that is the sort of state level need. And again, like that for us is that aspirational federalism structure.
Yeah, I mean,
we've.
No, go ahead, Nolan.
Well, I mean, this is a great, segue to an issue that we're dealing with here in California, where I think we've sort of taken that approach with an institution called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment process, where every 8 years we see.
That was exactly where I was going.
We
Yeah,
saw, and we
perfect.
were trying to copy that actually to some extent. So now you're going to tell me why it's not working for you and how you're trying to fix it. But
Well, I mean, this is something that when we push for reform at the state level, jurisdictions come and say, well, let us come up with local solutions, like let us lead. And RENA, I mean, is really probably the most flexible way you could possibly have structured this. We say to every jurisdiction, come up with a plan to permit at least this much housing over the next 8 years. And I think it's slightly underrated among like ornery YIMBYs on Twitter that like many jurisdictions do go along with this and they do this and they make a good faith effort. I mean, Sacramento just allowed missing middle housing citywide, partly as part of this plan. But the issue is that in so many of these local jurisdictions, there's a really robust coalition around exclusion. And like you have jurisdictions that are like, demographically very unrepresentative of the state as a whole, and then they're 95% homeowners. That, the politics of NIMBYism are really robust in those contexts. And even if we try to nudge them to open up a little bit, it ends up being a game of whack-a-mole. And I think that's something that I personally struggle with is like, well, we know that on a lot of these questions, we kind of do have to have a firm hand for how some of these rules are implemented, but how do we get that balance right? I mean, I know it's such a complicated question with no clear answer, but what do you leave with local jurisdictions and how do you structure those institutions? I mean, ideally, we get people to a place where there aren't these constituencies for exclusion, and then the local politics moves at the local level. But I'm wondering if you have thoughts on dealing with this issue of these, and this is a big issue in Massachusetts as well, right? These small jurisdictions that are effectively like glorified giant neighborhood associations where the politics of NIMBYism are rock solid.
yeah, no, it's a great question. And I it's not, in fact, implementing what I sort of laid out, I can't answer concretely whether we achieved any solutions. I mean, for us, what we were trying to do was have a kind of limited set of options, so not open-ended, and then penalties for not actually progressing forward. So we did have some sticks in there as well as carrots. So it's like a combination of sticks and carrots, constrained set of options. And then the other thing that was a part of what we were doing, which was maybe slightly wacky, I'd be curious what you think, but in that sort of spirit of like trying to dissolve NIMBYism as a cultural force. There was a sort of section of the policy agenda that was about the beauty of density, basically, and investing in culture work around sort of recognizing the many, many ways in which density brings beauty and cultural value, and trying to incentivize sort of pilots and experiments that would help people sort of narrate the story of the beauty and value of density. So we were trying to kind of bring the culture piece into it as well, alongside the sort of incentive design piece. And who knows, I don't know whether that would have, cracked the hard nut, but.
I think there's definitely, there's certainly an aesthetic quality to it of helping people to understand what we're talking about here. I mean, so like, I think this explains the salience maybe of missing middle is you talk about floor area ratios or setbacks, people start imagining like Hong Kong, right? But if you say like, hey, here's what a fourplex looks like, then this like, you're being a little bit silly, like going to the mat trying to block this, right? Yeah.
When we were wanting to have architectural competitions in that kind of space, and honestly trying to turn it into like a prestige thing, right? So that then like, if you're a prestige place, like you want some prestige architecture in your community, and like, here's what it looks like, and here's how you get it. So we were trying to totally like shift the valence around the aesthetics of density.
I love that too, because so often we talk about housing like it's a polluting industry that we have to put somewhere. Like, oh, okay, we have to put the landfill somewhere. So like, let's, everybody's going to take their small share of it. And we talk about housing, in California that way. And it's like, you maybe flipping the narrative as you're suggesting and saying, this is a good thing and you should desire it. And we can put up rules, in place to make this a thing that your community actively wants. To my mind, I think if a community wants more housing, then the problem starts to solve itself, right?
Right. Yeah. And that, I live in Cambridge, which is super, super dense. And, the amazing thing is actually there's a very significant portion of our community that does want more housing. And the reason is because people appreciate the value that in fact comes from living in a place of higher density. So, I mean, it's hard because obviously there are values that come from living in tranquil and verdant environments as well. And one can't pretend those values aren't there. I think the other thing to say is, I guess the other thing that we were working on in our sort of project was sort of also folding the land preservation conversation into the conversation, not actually holding it separate and apart, but actually appreciating the value of that piece as well. And so we were activating kind of climate commitments too, to advance density commitments. So it's sort of like, yeah, we do want to protect green and, verdant and unbuilt places. And therefore, we have a real responsibility to look at the built footprint already and, figure out how to make that serve, a growing population, because like that is just the fact of what we have to do. There's no way around it. So, but, enforcing that kind of the value of the verdant spaces too, and trying to, connect that again in through the kind of climate agenda and help people see that if you're committed to the climate agenda, then you actually also have to be committed to the density agenda.
Yeah, there's something interesting about, I think, getting at the cultural differences. I think some of the cultural challenges between New England and California when it comes to encouraging the production of new housing. I grew up in New England myself. I grew up in Middletown, Connecticut, and so I remember from my childhood that there's this sort of real tradition in New England of the sort of, I don't know, like town hall democracy, that very kind of early New England Puritan political tradition. There's still vestiges of it. And there's also, I think there's just a lot more old buildings in Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, like a lot of buildings that significantly predate the existence of California as a state. And so I could imagine both the challenges with NIMBY busybodies and the challenges with historic preservation being pretty severe in ways that we might not necessarily appreciate in California. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that.
That is correct. That is a very big deal. And you're right. I mean, the historical preservation piece is really huge. And so again, that really came down to why, at the end of the day, for our policy, we didn't, in fact, just say, okay, here's blanket statewide, it's going to be X, Y, and Z. Why we said it's going to be this limited menu, and then every town is going to have to pick from this menu, and there's going to be a date certain, and it's all going to be part of a strategy process and so forth. Was precisely because we did think that different municipalities were going to have to balance somewhat differently the concerns of historical preservation, land preservation, and density, and that there wasn't a kind of cookie cutter that we could actually sort of dictate from the top. Again, there was like directionality we could dictate from the top for everybody, but there was going to have to be context-specific decision making. So that was a really big, important part of why we approached it the way we did. Though I want to also say, from what I just said, you'll have heard another important difference between New England and California. So I just referred to our towns making decisions, right? And we do, in principle, have counties, but the truth is, county governance, it matters in two places in Massachusetts. It matters in Western Mass, the Berkshires sort of area, and it matters on the Cape. And in both cases, because they're sort of, the more rural sort of, so to speak, parts of the state. So they have felt the pressures of regionalization earlier and more intensely. And so I started to operate. But everywhere else, it's like just literally municipality by municipality. And so we really do have that kind of jurisdictional problem where there are many things that would be much better handled at a regional level, and they're just not there yet. So solving that problem, in the Northeast, I think is one of our critical jobs.
Yeah, I mean, in Connecticut, counties are literally just lines on a map. There's no county government at all. And so coming to California, where counties have quite a bit of power, it was a big cognitive leap for me to understand that what county you were in actually mattered for some fairly basic questions.
Yep, exactly. So, but I mean, again, this is where I I aspire to, I hope that collectively we can all actually build more of an intentional conversation around this issue of jurisdictional levels and how to like make sure the problem is being tackled at the right level, because I do think like just the fact that we don't directly talk about that is one of our biggest problems.
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised that. I mean, a point that I think about a lot is housing markets and labor markets are metropolitan, right? And yet we decide where housing and jobs are going to go at a hyper local level.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of work to be done there. I mean, we kind of have the beginnings of metropolitan governance with things like MPOs, but it's amazing. I was doing a little bit of research on this, and you go back to the 60s and 70s, kind of like the dying embers of like high modernist planning, and they are like thinking about metropolitan and regional planning. And in fact, like this vestige still exists. And like my degree is technically Master of City and Regional Planning, but the regional stuff has almost completely fallen off of that. But I hope that more folks will start to think about that, of the appropriate scale of some of these decisions. And I appreciate you raising that.
Yeah. No, thank you for saying that. And I think it is a thing we could tackle. And I think the thing I'm trying to add is that in addition to doing regional planning, we actually have to think through the governance piece, right? And that is to your point where it gets so complicated because we have all the different jurisdictions that are kind of calling on our taxes and our time and so forth. And that's no good, right? You can't have a proliferation of that. So you have to have some kind of streamlining to make that work. And then that, of course, gets you to the kind of political challenge of how you drive change there. But, you know, these things do change over time, right? So again, for me, it's kind of a question of, it's the how question. How can we proactively facilitate the emergence of more effective, kind of better leveled jurisdictional structures?
I want to ask, stepping back a little bit here, to I think this some of what you talk about in the book and then this essay. I think there's a certain type of abundance progressive who would say, we just need a Robert Moses, but like a good one, right? We just need a Robert Moses who's going to build trains and bike lanes and lots of housing. What would a power sharing liberal say to maybe caution that like hardliner abundance progressive perspective?
Yeah. So thank you for that question. I mean, so I think there is the basically the moral response, and then there's also the pragmatic response. And I'm sorting those out because you know, I'm a political philosopher. My book is trying to kind of offer an account of justice, and therefore my kind of first response is always a moral one. Moral responses are not always convincing to people, let's just say. They, you know, people will pursue their own interests, even if they kind of get there's maybe a kind of moral issue. But as a moral matter, this is where, at the end of the day, I just am making the case that sharing power is the right thing to do for maximizing human well-being and flourishing. And you know, I won't kind of bore you with the details right now, but the sort of simple fact is the design of our institutions in this country was originally premised on the notion that you could, in some sense, protect the rights of everybody without everybody having a chance to share power. And that's just false. You can't do it. And somebody always gets like badly screwed if they don't actually have the chance to share power. So, you know, I don't know who the new good Robert Moses is going to accidentally badly screw, but they will screw somebody. And that doesn't seem right. There's always people who lose out from every policy process. But the people who lose out should have had the chance to participate in that process. And that just seems to me a kind of fundamental moral truth. So I sort of start there. But pragmatically speaking, the reason that pragmatically matters is because at the end of the day, healthy democracies where people do have that chance to participate in the stuff that affects them have the capacity to be the most stable, most legitimate forms of government that there are, for the obvious reason that people buy into them. And when you erode that with the kind of technocratic top-down work, you are giving away stability. You just are. So that's your trade-off. Like, you can have that if you want, but I can also promise you you're going to get resentment and frustration and instability. So, all right, but then you got to deal with all that kind of political difficulty and challenge. So.
Right, and I think, well, that's exactly what happened, right? Is that there was a reaction to that high modernist technocratic moment of radical sort of we're going to have environmental reviews and checkpoints and endless hearings,
Right.
and I think the challenge facing us now is how do we get that balance right, not how do
Yes.
we go back to the previous order.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's a balance question. Exactly. And so I guess that's where, I mean, maybe what I'm trying to put on the table is the idea that this sort of aspirational federalism idea, like, planner, yes, give us the macro concept, okay? But then step two, ask the question of what actions do we need to take in our local context that would actually achieve that macro concept? And then how do we use a combination of carrots and sticks, like incentives and penalties where necessary, to deliver that? And along the way, like, how do we also check whether or not, you know, that those things we're doing to achieve that kind of macro good, which is good for everybody, are also figuring out how to achieve alignment with other high priority values. Not with all values, like, you're going to have to make some choices, right? But people should get the chance to say, let's figure out how to align this high priority common good value with some of our other high priority values. And that, like, I use that language of alignment very intentionally. And I think if that's the sort of structure, like, we're inviting you to figure out how to get alignment for things you also care about with a thing that is a common good value, that's a little different than sort of structuring it as like, it's going to be a hard trade-off conversation, like either you win or you win. But no, like, can we restructure these as alignment conversations?
Yeah, I think part of what's interesting about that, and you mentioned it a little bit when you were referring to the Taiwan model, is I think a lot of times with housing, but with all kinds of questions that are decided through local democratic processes, democratic in air quotes, because I don't actually think the community input model that we use for housing approvals is especially democratic, but it's often it's usually a sort of binary choice. And what appeals to me about the idea of having a more sort of deliberative democratic approach at the planning level is this idea of saying, okay, here are the housing needs for this particular area. Here are the sort of the economic goals we have, the goals in terms of social mobility, in terms of fair housing. Like, how do, like, let's together create a sort of zoning map or general plan that satisfies as many of those different priorities as we possibly can. That's a much more, I think, sort of nuanced conversation, and it kind of puts people in the position of like, you can't really say no. You have to have something constructive to offer.
Exactly. That was really well said, and that really does get at what we're trying to develop as a sort of a framework here, again, under the sort of aspirational federalism label. So, yeah. I will say one other last little thing from the housing agenda we developed. I mean, the other thing we did do was we did sort of like try to scrub, municipal laws to identify those things that were really producing that NIMBY problem, right? You know, the sort of voting rules at town meetings, or the way public notice is handled, or like the times meetings were held and so forth. And we did have some proposals, the purpose of which was to kind of adjust that governance structure to reduce that effect too. But that was sort of within the existing structure, one of the ways we were trying to tackle it. But
yeah, I mean, a lot of this has me I think an underutilized planning institution, the way that planning was originally conceived, was you sit down and you do a comprehensive plan, or a general plan, or a master plan, depending on the state, and you kind of that's a stage at which you actually can do something like democratic deliberation, and you can go out and get a cross section of the community and agree on high level values.
Right.
And it strikes me that something's gone really wrong with our planning institutions is every jurisdiction will still produce these, but they just end up going on a shelf and collecting dust, and then the actual day-to-day planning work is untethered from this. But then we still say, well, but we still need to have some sort of community engagement on this issue, and it's never, well, let's consult this document where we did really, really robust engagement.
Right.
It's, let's just do more of it. And my hometown of Lexington, Kentucky, I think has, and as it has a few other jurisdictions, places like Minneapolis, they've been able to actually undertake some pretty radical reforms, because there was the the consensus has already been built in the form of this comprehensive planning document. And I
Exactly.
think it's an underrated lesson for cities.
Yeah, we had put that kind of comprehensive planning into our agenda, and I think you're exactly right. And I appreciate your calling that out as an underutilized resource. And I think that's a very astute observation that a dynamic has developed where that consensus building process like goes on the shelf, and then people kind of add on new participatory processes rather than relying on the first one and kind of continually calling people back to it. So I do think that's really, well spotted, and I think a thing for us all to think about. So,
Well, speaking of additional opportunities for participation, should we do the lightning round, Nolan?
uh-oh.
Go for it.
Okay, so we're just going to ask a series of rapid fire questions, just whatever comes to mind. First one is favorite U.S. city, and I'm gonna say for this one, not in Massachusetts, because having run for governor of Massachusetts, I'm afraid you'll give a politic answer if I say Massachusetts is allowed.
Right. Well, it's funny, I actually, as Nolan was saying, his hometown was Lexington, Kentucky. I love Lexington, Kentucky, and I do love Lexington, Kentucky. So, and the reason I love it is because of an organization there called Civic Lex. I don't know if you know about this, Nolan, but which really is doing an amazing job of rebuilding community processes for collective learning about things that are happening at the county level, decision making, supporting deliberative process around them, and so forth. So it sounds like maybe there is some long-standing tradition in Lexington that has made it, there's a reason this organization emerged in Lexington. So anyway, I'm going to say Lexington, Kentucky today.
I will happily take that and not mention all of the chaotic planning stuff that I'm not going to mention in this talk.
Yeah.
Where's the best place to get lunch in Cambridge?
Oh gosh. Well, whatever. This is, such a boring answer, but I do love Tate in particular, and I love their, avocado salmon tartine.
And favorite global city.
Favorite global city. Oof. Wow. That's a really good question. That is such a good question. I mean, I have to admit my experience is relatively limited. I've only traveled outside of Europe like 3 times. So in that regard, I don't have the range of, so I have a lot of places I'd love to go. I have a long list of desired places to go. I think I might have to say London, mainly just because honestly, I know it the best. I lived in England for 3 years and so forth. So it's a kind of second home city for me. So I think I'll say London. And obviously I love just how global it is, as a city internally to itself. It's extraordinary. So.
Yeah, London's fantastic. If you could get every state legislator in California to read one work of political philosophy, maybe other than your own work, what book would you have them read?
Oh my goodness. Oh, yikes. You probably warned me in advance about these questions and I failed to process the warning. One book of political philosophy, and they can only read one book. What would be the most important thing for people to read right now?
They might spring off and read other books, but this is one where you're like, you really need to read this one.
Okay. I would probably take them back to Dewey, The Public and Its Problems.
Oh, that's great. Yep.
Yeah, we Nolan and I were talking about American pragmatism actually earlier today. Okay. Not making that up. These are the conversations we have at California EMB.
There you go. That's why I'm so glad to talk to you.
Speaking of, so on my bookshelf behind me, I have a copy of The Human Condition by Hannah Arendt that you did the foreword to. And so springing off of that, because I thought The Human Condition was a fascinating, mind-bending read, but it's also just a real, it's a very dense book. And so what would your recommendation be for an introduction to Hannah Arendt to our listeners?
Okay, so if folks wanted to kind of understand her mind, but not have to, tackle that dense text.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of interesting things that are easier reads for people. I'd probably point to three. There's a book, and I'm sorry, I'm always terrible at titles. I never exactly precisely remember them, but I believe it goes by the title On Revolution, which is about kind of comparison of the American and the French Revolution. And it's a kind of, because the sort of history is sort of straightforward, it's a bit of an easier read and super interesting. And a lot of her basic insights about politics and social stability and legitimacy and constitutionalism are all available there. There's also Eichmann in Jerusalem, which is, a bracing read. It's a story, she covered as a journalist effectively the post-Holocaust trial of Adolf Eichmann, who was a sort of functionary in the Nazi regime. He was not a decision maker. And so the question was he guilty, given that he processed basically the killings of many, many Jewish people, but he didn't give the orders. And so it's a very powerful argument about the banality of evil, is the important phrase that comes out of that the problem is that people can not pay attention to how their ordinary actions are having quite significant consequences. And like the fact that they're actually complicit in evil just becomes a kind of matter, like the banality of everyday actions. It's very bracing and an important read. And then the last book I would name is one called Men in Dark Times, which is very fitting for our own particular political moment. And it's a sort of series of essays about intellectuals in Germany, sort of, I think mostly during the period of Nazism. It's been a long time since I've read it, and how they handled the challenges of that time. And, sort of real kind of, some people kind of going underground and just trying to kind of keep a certain kind of light alive, some trying to figure out how to navigate things in a more direct way. But it's a bracing book, but also kind of really thoughtful and humane book.
Okay, well, hopefully the New York Times or Ezra Klein won't sue us for ending this episode with 3 book recommendations. Professor Danielle Allen, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Really appreciated the conversation. And as I said at the start, just really so grateful for your good work. Thank you.